On today's programme.
With this attack, Iran has once again shown its true colours. They are intent on sowing chaos in their own backyard, on further destabilising the Middle East.
After this attack on Israel over the weekend, should we do more to stand up to Iran? The Rwanda bill is on the brink of becoming law, but what will the policy achieve?
We simply cannot accept amendments that provide for loopholes which would perpetuate the current cycle of delays and late legal challenges to removal.
2 years of headline-chasing gimmicks. 2 years of pursuing a policy that is fundamentally unworkable, unaffordable and unlawful.
I just wonder if it all sounds like you're looking for somebody else to blame.
Well, I do believe that. I mean, what I am saying is yes.
It was somebody else's fault.
Well, I'm not saying I'm perfect, and, you know, nobody's perfect.
Liz Truss says why she thinks her premiership ended after just 49 days.
The hate monster wants you to feel like you need to show you're better than them. Then, before you know it, you've committed a hate crime.
Will Scotland's new hate crime law protect vulnerable people or undermine free speech? Joining me to discuss all that, Conservative MP Heather Wheeler, Labour's Sarah Owen, Alison Thewlis from the SNP and former Conservative government advisor Salma Shah. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's statement. You saw a little bit of it there in the headlines. He gave to the Commons yesterday in the wake of Iran's bombardment on Israel at the weekend. This is how some of the papers are reporting what he said. The Eye, Britain and US tell Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, don't start a world war with Iran revenge. The Financial Times has this: US and Europe in frantic diplomacy to deter Israel from striking back at Iran. The Times: Prime Minister rejects mounting calls to ban Iran group. There were many, mainly Conservative MPs, calling for the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard group to be banned. And this in the Daily Telegraph. Ben Wallace, former Defence Secretary, the West must stand up to Iranian bullies. Let's start with some of the comments made by Ben Wallace. He said, "I've learnt working against Britain's adversaries that the only way to deal with a bully is to retaliate. The only option when Iran and Russia hit, I have concluded, is to hit back twice as hard and not stop until they get the message." Is he right, Ben Wallace?
Ben definitely knows of what he speaks. The truth is, nobody wants this to turn into the next World War. And so the fact that it was a completely irrelevant 300 drone attack on Israel that just did not work at all. And so take the win from that, is my view.
Right, so you don't think Israel should retaliate. What about Ben Wallace saying that the world, more broadly, should stand up to Iran?
Well, that's absolutely true, and that's why keeping the diplomatic channels open is incredibly important. And that's what Lord Cameron said, and I think I agree with him.
What about Ben Wallace said? We actually do need to stand up to Iran. It's what Israel has been saying for many, many years.
I think what Ben Wallace has said and the timing of what he said is actually uncharacteristically irresponsible. Right now we need to be seeing a de-escalation of tensions and violence, because what we're going to see is beyond region, possibly conflict spreading even further, and what we need to see is a calming and some of that restraint which we've been hearing about as well.
Right, I mean, you're talking about Israel here in terms of any retaliation that it says it will carry out at some stage. But more broadly, what he's saying is that the world, including the UK and the US, should do more to stand up to the bully that is Iran.
That's very easy, I would say, for Ben to say now he's not on the front benches and taking decisions. But what I would say is we've heard this rhetoric before, and where does it end? We need to hear a clear plan and a strategy if that is the decisions that this government is going to take.
What does standing up to Iran, do you think, actually mean?
Are you back at me?
Yeah.
OK. I think standing up to Iran means that we can look at different sets of sanctions, even more sanctions, taking over property, taking over bank accounts. Wouldn't that be an amazing irony to use that money to rebuild Gaza? I think that would be rather good, and then that would actually, I believe, that would stop them in their tracks.
Right. I mean, what do you think? Do you think we should stand up to Iran? Do some of the things that Heather has suggested?
Well, I would also question what does standing up to Iran actually look like in practice? Is that going to be military action? Because that's a really big threshold to cross. I would agree that there needs to be further looking at sanctions on those involved with the Iranian regime, because they are, let's not forget, carrying out all kinds of things against their own people as well, particularly against women. So we need to be looking at sanctions and the full suite of sanctions that can be carried out there as well, including the Magnitsky-style sanctions against individuals. I think we also need to look quite closely, as has been mentioned, at the IRGC and their operations and making them a prescribed organisation, because I have constituents coming to me very worried about the operations of the IRGC in the UK. People who are living in the UK feeling under threat themselves, being stalked by people by the IRGC, and there really needs to be further consideration of that. And I really don't understand what has taken the government so long to do anything about this.
Well, they say they're not going to prescribe the organisation, and this is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and that is because Downing Street, or the government, has intimated that they need to keep some sort of channel open diplomatically with Iran, and that would mean not prescribing that organisation.
This problem with Iran hasn't just started in the last few weeks. Over a year ago, we suggested that the Revolutionary Guard should be prescribed, and the government have been dragging their heels on it, and now I just don't understand why.
Right, what do you think, Salma? Broadly speaking, do you think the UK's been too slow to stand up to Iran, to sort of have the discussion we're having now?
I think there's a confusion here about the pace of our dealings with Iran. So if you take a step back from this, there are two things that need to happen, and they're not mutually exclusive, but they are separate. One is, how do you de-escalate the situation that is occurring now? You have a reaction from Iran on Israel's action on their consulate in Damascus, and this was the retaliation. If you're talking to a lot of diplomatic watchers, they're saying that actually Iran's forewarning and the fact that the missiles were deflected were enough for them to save face with their own people, their own regime.
And say that's the end of the retaliation.
And so that we talk about the end of it and we move on. So now the ball is very much in Israel's court. So how do we de-escalate that? How do we use our diplomatic efforts in order to do that? That is one issue. Ben Wallace is very interesting here because he has not said that he thinks that actually there should be military action on our part. I think what he's talking about, which is much more interesting and much more substantial, is what have we done up till now as far as Iran is concerned? And there was a big play in the Obama administration, and certainly by the French, to be able to talk to Iran to try and normalise that relationship. I think Ben Wallace's wider point, and as it was with Russia, is that how successful has that been, and is that something that we should continually pursue? Not only that, but very significantly, he was talking about Israel's reaction to us when we were going, backing the Ukrainians against Putin, and Israel was slow to want to back Western allies. Perfectly legitimate, perfectly right for it to make its own decisions in its own interest. But attacking Iran, as Ben Wallace will understand, in any kind of military way, will mean that there is further polarisation in these aspects with China and Russia and other hostile state actors, and pushing more people as proxies in that battle.
Just before we move on, Sarah, you are one of a number of Labour MPs who have called for a stop to UK arms sales to Israel. Do you still think that that looks wise?
Yes, I do. And I think that although it's regrettable that we've seen this escalation of violence between Iran and Israel now, actually we still need to hold Israel to account and to the same standards as every other country that we do arms sales with, and that we need to stop this, and we need to see the government publish the legal advice that they have been given.
Right. I mean, you will have heard the Foreign Secretary David Cameron being asked about this and saying we have very strict guidelines for dealing with arms exports. If we uniquely said we're going to put in place an arms embargo, I think that would be wrong, and I think it would have looked ridiculous in light of the attack Israel suffered from Iran. What do you say in response?
I don't agree with him, and I think that if his legal advice actually backs him up, then he shouldn't be afraid to publish it.
Do you think it should be? You're shaking your head.
I mean, this is realpolitik. You do not publish, as so many other people are finding out. this week, you don't publish legal documents, and that when you're in government, you God forbid, but that is exactly what you would have to do. So
there's an issue of parliamentary scrutiny as well, because the Arms Export Control Committee, which is supposed to be the mechanism by which Parliament scrutinises arms deals, that hasn't met. That doesn't function in any meaningful sense at all. It hasn't met for quite some time now, and that really ought to be reinstated so that scrutiny happens in Parliament, because there is no mechanism at the moment.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not government's responsibility for that to meet. That's a parliamentary committee.
It needs to happen, though.
Right, OK, but that's not the government's responsibility.
And it would be alongside
so
what the government...
You're going to put an EGM down on the Speaker because he hasn't got round to doing it.
It's not, I don't think that's entirely in the Speaker's hand, but it's an important mechanism of scrutiny that just doesn't happen at the moment.
Let's talk about the Rwanda bill and show you this headline in the Daily Mail. Record day yet for Channel migrants, with 534 crossing on Sunday in small boats, as MPs are set to finally approve Rwanda deportation flights this week. That is the expectation. There has been parliamentary ping-pong between the House of Commons and the House of Lords, with MPs rejecting and overturning amendments made by the House of Lords last night, but it is returning to the Lords today. Those figures that I've just read out, Heather, it shows large numbers of people are continuing to make that crossing. In fact, they're at a record high, I think, compared to this time last year. Even if a few flights take off to Rwanda, it's not going to stop the boats, which is what Rishi Sunak pledged he would do.
I think it will, because I think
it'll stop them completely.
It'll break the business model of the evil people traffickers. It's great that my Labour friend is shaking her head. Labour have got no plan on this whatsoever, because all you're going to do is allegedly follow on from what we're doing. So, you know, working upstream, I mean, where the boats are coming into Germany and then going across, all of those bits need to be stopped. And that's what we're doing as well.
Sarah?
With the greatest respect, Heather, you're talking nonsense in terms of this. £400 million spent by this government, and not a single person has left.
Yeah, but you know
and
exactly
if this
why,
bill, let
the
me
judges.
finish. And if
That's
this bill
why.
passes, it'll be an extra £50 million. And right now, people are crying out for that extra investment within their communities. And we do have a plan. What you don't need is another gimmick, which is what this is. We've got a plan to crack down on the gangs, boost the National Crime Agency, actually clear the backlog that your government has created in various Home Secretaries.
And would that stop the boats?
And I think having a review of the resettlement routes, actually having safe and legal routes, because right now
I've got another 100,000 people to come in. That's what you're going to go. If you do that,
under
it's
your government right
100,000
now.
people coming in.
That's what you've got right now under your government. But what I want to see is some fairness. What I want to see is some fairness. Right now, I've got an Afghan female surgeon who is a sister of my constituent in Luton North. There is no safe and legal route for her to get here. None at all, and she is in hiding. Can you tell me a safe and legal route to get here?
Well, funnily enough, there's a very good charity that sponsors people to come in, and you know.
No.
Well,
and we also need to have humanitarian support for the regions and the parts of the world where this crisis is actually happening at the root of it.
I completely agree
there
with you there.
There's a plan.
I'm a supporter of foreign aid.
I'm
a supporter because we need to stop it at root. That's exactly what we need to do.
The truth of it is that this Rwanda bill is actually about Rishi Sunak trying to hold his party together and his weakness to stand up to his backbenchers, because this isn't working.
When were you not knocking on doors?
This weekend.
So I was up in Blackpool South. And every other door that is voting Conservative, maybe it's a Conservative thing, I don't know, said if you stop the boats, then that will deal with it.
Not many doors then, was it?
Well, it was plenty, thank you very much.
Well, let's talk about the issue, the principle at the heart of it, which is a deterrent. Do you, in any sense, if flights were to take off, think it would be a deterrent?
No, because this has all been about a deterrent as it is. And what we've seen is record numbers of people taking that dangerous decision. And what we're seeing is people being holed up in hotels, being delayed whether they're going to stay or whether they're going to leave. And it has made a bad situation worse.
If flights take off, will it turn around Rishi Sunak's fortunes?
I think that it will at least be a policy that he promised that he delivered. So I think as far as that is concerned, it's a political pledge that is met, and then it sort of neutralises some of the criticism that's come his way. I think on your question of, you know, will it stop the boats, there'll be a lag effect here. So will he realise the sort of numbers, the reduction in numbers, if it does have an effect? It won't stop the boats, but the deterrent aspect of it is a big bet. And one of the reasons that it's argued that there were more people that were coming in through that channel route is because there are cutters now and more likelihood of being saved in the channel than there were previously, but that is trying to prevent loss of life.
Well, let me just point you to this headline in the Times. Revealed, it says, UK targets 4 countries for Rwanda deal. Leaked documents show the Foreign Office has shortlisted more countries to which to deport migrants as the Safety of Rwanda Bill is set to receive royal assent. Now, some of the other countries listed: Costa Rica, Ivory Coast and Armenia. And the top Home Office civil servant told a parliamentary committee earlier that the government has looked at a tiny number of other countries. Do you think it should be extended to more countries?
Absolutely.
What do you think, Sarah? I mean, you don't like Rwanda. I will come to you. You don't like Rwanda, but do you not like Rwanda because the courts have deemed Rwanda unsafe, or is it that you don't like any idea of a scheme of deporting or offshoring asylum applications?
I think Rwanda hasn't worked. It's proven to be an absolute money pit, and they're talking about expanding it to other countries. It's just ludicrous.
You're against it morally, aren't you?
Yes, I think it is tantamount to state-sponsored people trafficking. It is people being sent against their will to other countries around the world and not being allowed to come back. I think it's absolutely appalling, and it doesn't take our own responsibilities as a country seriously as well. We have international obligations under the Refugee Convention, under anti-trafficking conventions, all of these international treaties that we were part of setting up as the UK. We are now seeking to undermine with this Rwanda legislation. It's absolutely appalling.
And you would have safe routes from everywhere?
I think there needs to be safe routes, because if you look, you talked about the Afghanistan routes earlier on.
How many,
they do
Alison?
not. The Afghanistan routes, for example,
how many
do not
safe routes?
work.
Are we saying from all parts of the world?
I think there needs to be an option for people to travel safely, because at the moment people are travelling on small boats because there is no other mechanism for them to get to the UK. That's putting themselves at risk, it's putting everybody at risk, because they're travelling in a very unsafe manner. But they are doing that because there are no other choices. So to claim, I was just going to say, to claim asylum, you have to physically get to the UK. If there was an option where you could apply from abroad, you could travel more safely if you're able to apply, say, from a UK embassy in another country. That isn't an option available to people at the moment.
All right.
And that could then be assessed in a sensible, meaningful way.
The difficulty here, though, is that even if you apply, if you're refused an asylum claim, so if you get to a safe country, so say you apply from France at this point, there is still nothing...
Which you can't do at the moment.
But so let's hypothetically take your plan. Even if you apply and you're refused, there is still then the illegal route open to you. And so there is no deterrent to say that I'm going to apply and then I'm going to go. So you are quite often in a situation in this country where you have people who've been refused their asylum applications but still stay, and it's very hard to remove. To find and remove them. So they're actually here illegally, and with all the exploitation that comes with it. So I think you've got to think through beyond that and what's actually going to happen in that process. And these won't be edge cases. These could actually be significant. So I think there's a lot of... I've heard a lot of stuff. I mean, I'm an ex-Home Office advisor. I've heard a lot of stuff here that doesn't always seem to follow with what the answer is going to be. So one minute we're sort of trying to deal with all the world's issues in terms of climate change and conflict, and we need to go and sort at the root. I mean, the root is a very big problem. So I don't know how that's an answer. And then it's like, we'll just administer what we're already doing better. Well, clearly there's a problem. So I don't feel like a lot of what's coming out as a solution really follows up with what the challenges have been.
I mean, Alison, you put it in pretty stark terms, your views about the Rwanda scheme in the Commons in December. Let's just have a listen.
This is an assault on human rights. We should not let this stand from this House, because human rights are universal and they are for everybody, not who the Home Secretary thinks that they should apply to. This bill is a dangerous distraction. It is part of a march towards fascism. Every single piece. I do not say that lightly, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I do not say these things lightly.
Right, so the SNP's view is that the Rwanda scheme constitutes a march to fascism.
because that's how these things start. It starts by othering other people. It starts by treating people as less than human, which is what this bill does. It says that these people don't have rights, which again is a very worrying beginning to this. And it says that we can do with them as we please. We can lift them, we can put them to Rwanda, we can do other things.
You think that is a fair description of the Rwanda policy? Heather, that will be you taking part, or at least encouraging a march to fascism.
Yeah, well, what about the human rights of the people in Blackpool South? What about the human rights of the people in Melbourne? What about the rights of,
Human rights are for everybody.
Well, that's fine.
Without question.
But then, we are a very small country.
And most of the people that claim refugee status do so next to the countries from which they have fled. We have a very tiny proportion of people that actually do come to the UK. Most of them are successful in their applications. And most of those people have ties to the UK already. They might have a family member here. They might have been part of the British Empire at some point. They might speak English. They may have good reason to come here, and most of them do.
Very sadly, many, many, many do not.
That's not true.
Well, there you go.
Right, I mean, there was, of course, a deal done with Albania where large numbers were returned, and the majority of those were found to be either economic migrants or trafficked. Do you still stand by accusing those who support the scheme on being complicit in a march to fascism?
I think there is evidence that people who have been victims of trafficking from Albania, particularly women, have been very harmfully affected by this. And there's a risk of re-trafficking in some of these cases as well. They've been moved back and forth, they've been exploited, and we need to take our obligations again under anti-trafficking agreements very seriously indeed. And again, with the legislation that's come forward in the Illegal Migration Act and in the Rwanda bill, we're not even assessing people to say, have you been trafficked? We're not looking at their applications, and that's exceptionally worrying.
Do you agree it is a march to fascism?
I wouldn't go as far as Alison, but where I would say that there is a deep inconsistency here is around the protection of the most vulnerable people. To say that some of these people are victims of human trafficking from Albania, yet to take away any asylum seekers' rights to claim modern slavery, for example, is just an absolute farce. And it's cruel and it's inefficient, and the way that this government has dealt with it isn't in tune with the British people.
Salma?
I think that in terms of the way that you are processing this, I mean, I need to go back and look at the legislation in more detail as to what's being put back into the laws. Because in terms of the way that these applications are processed, if you've been trafficked here, and if you're talking about refugee status, the conventions still apply. This is about people who are coming over through illegal routes, who are coming over as economic migrants. We always had a returns policy, even when we were in the EU. That's the Dublin 1, Dublin 2 regulations.
Didn't work particularly successfully.
Exactly, and that was one of the reasons, actually, that a strong case was made for Brexit. And in fact, the European Union itself is arguing with itself at the moment about its own Dublin 2 regulations that it's still implementing. And there is globally a big push for third country processing. So I think you have to understand what are the pressures that are coming as a consequence. Yes, it's not to say that people who are being trafficked or refugees should be caught up in this, but being able to process and assess that correctly, there's still a right for a country to determine who comes in and who doesn't. That is the sole focus of what a state should do.
Well, we're going to finish it there because we will hear by the end of the week, maybe, whether it has got royal assent or not. Let's talk about the former Prime Minister, well, one of them anyway, Liz Truss. She has written a book called 10 Years to Save the West. I can hear all this deep inhalation on the panel. Lessons from the only Conservative in the room. She has been trying to give an explanation as to why her premiership failed so spectacularly after just 49 days. Let's hear what she had to say to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason.
You had the Bank of England, which was running monetary policy, actively not supporting what the government was doing. We didn't know. We were sitting on a tinderbox. And
which you set fire to.
Well,
I just wonder if it all sounds like you're looking for somebody else to blame.
Well, I do believe that. I mean, what I am saying is yes.
It was somebody else's fault.
Well, I'm not saying I'm perfect, and nobody's perfect. It's all very well saying, Liz, do you accept any of the blame? I'm frankly not going to let them get off the hook. And I think many government ministers don't want to admit how impotent they are. That is the reality. The Bank of England had a very, very significant role in what happened. the Office of Budget Responsibility had a very significant role in what happened. I haven't seen them get anything like the level of scrutiny or, questions that I've got.
So they don't get the scrutiny, but they do have the power. Is effectively the argument.
Well, politicians have ended up having responsibility without power, and quangocrats have ended up having power without responsibility and more job security, as I found out.
That was Liz Truss talking to Chris Mason. Let's talk now to Mark Littlewood, Director of Popular Conservatism, which campaigns on some of the issues you heard there from the former Prime Minister, and in fact was a campaign group, I think, inspired by Liz Truss. Welcome to you, Mark Littlewood. This issue of Liz Truss, she does sound as if she is blaming everybody else but herself for her own demise.
No, I don't think that's fair, actually. I have read her book out today, cover to cover. She doesn't think she's blameless, but I think she makes a very important point in that discussion with Chris Mason, that certainly on what happened to the markets back in 2022, there's plenty of blame to go around, and all of it seems to have been placed on her shoulders. The Bank of England seems to have got away scot-free. No suggestion that, Andrew Bailey should resign despite missing his targets month after month after month. And the key point that I think Truss points out, and an important one, whether you are remotely sympathetic to her personally or indeed her political agenda, is how powerful is the sort of bureaucratic infrastructure of the UK at the moment, the Bank of England, the Office for Budget Responsibility she mentioned, compared to the elected politicians. And I think we've allowed to grow up an infrastructure which isn't a conspiracy, but has a certain sort of groupthink that mitigates against certain sort of policy proposals. And that's one of the big reasons she came unstuck.
Right, but I take from what you've just said about the blame is that actually there were more people to blame, but it still went spectacularly wrong. And the fact that actually the institutions didn't back Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng in their ill-fated mini-budget might have actually been the best thing that happened to the UK, because it helped end her premiership. So would you agree that it was still the wrong thing to do?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by it. I mean, I agreed with the board.
£45 billion of unfunded tax cuts, rolling out the mini-budget. I mean, the implication you've just given is that, no, she's not the only one to blame. They're all to blame.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a vast amount of blame. Obviously, she's paid the price with her political career, out in 49 days, the shortest-serving Prime Minister ever. But I think that we need to... I mean, the implication of what you just asked me, Jo, was it right for the institutions to undermine the mandate of the Prime Minister? I mean, that can never be right. I don't want unelected officials deciding what the appropriate course of policy action is. They should be answerable to our elected politicians.
So was she just not very good? But was she just not very good at her job? Was she just out of her depth?
Well, I think she got spectacularly unlucky as well. You'll have to judge whether, she was up to the task or not. We'll really never know after 49 days, not really enough to sort of audit, only on 7 weeks. A large tranche of the Conservative Party was unsympathetic to her policy proposals. So even with a majority of 80, it would have been very hard to pilot through. And you mentioned, Jo, these sort of unfunded tax cuts. I mean, it's worth remembering she was attempting at the same time to dampen the welfare bill by not putting it up with very high inflation but putting up with wage growth. That didn't go down very well within a wing of her party as well. So part of the Conservative Party...
well, we've got a representative of the Conservative Party who did actually back Liz Truss at some point during her leadership campaign. Alison, the response generally that unelected institutions just shouldn't undermine an elected Prime Minister.
Well, I think, having been our Treasury spokesperson before, those unelected institutions that are being referred to here get an awful lot of scrutiny at the Treasury Select Committee. They come in very regularly, they're scrutinised on their decisions, they're scrutinised on why they made the calls that they did, and that happens quite regularly. But this is the feature of the independence of the Bank of England. It has been set up in such a way that it is independent and quite purposely so. So, there's a debate to be had, I suppose, if people want to have it, about whether you want an independent Bank of England or not. But to blame them for doing what they are set up to do, it seems absolutely ludicrous and bang on form for Liz Truss and the type of person that she has become.
Mark?
Well, I mean, the Bank of England was set up with one specific remit to keep inflation at around 2%. If that's what it's set up to do, it has spectacularly failed. I don't know what scrutiny the Governor of the Bank of England is under. I understand he has to write a letter sort of basically apologising to the Chancellor every time he misses that target. But that just seems to be on rinse and repeat now. Copy and paste and send another one. That target's been spectacularly missed. Well, so if there's scrutiny, there doesn't really appear to be accountability. That's my concern and my worry.
All right, well, let me bring the others in. Sarah, do you agree with Liz Truss that politicians have become impotent, less powerful?
Well, I think that, crikey, Liz Truss just never goes away, does she? And I think that's the biggest problem for the Conservatives right now, is that not only is she not taking accountability for the disastrous budget she passed, she now still wants to be leader of the Tory party. And I have to say that, no, she isn't alone to blame in that. Some blame has to lie with people like Mark, people like Heather, who actually put her in that position in the first place. She actually says in her book that it's like the happiest day of her premiership was the day that she passed that budget that meant that people lost their homes, that meant that inflation sky high, that the pound plummeted. How can anybody in their right mind say that that was the proudest and happiest thing that they did? Mark? That's the danger.
Yeah, there's a million things that came together. Just before the mini-budget, the Bank of England put up interest rates rather less than was expected, so the pound fell against that. Interest rates were always going to go up, by the way. This fantasy that the sort of almost negative interest rates that we've had since the financial crash could go on forever, and we could continue to get drunk on cheap credit, absolutely ludicrous. We were going to see a correction in interest rates so that savings actually pay. That happened, I don't think because of the mini-budget, for a whole range of factors. That was happening right across the globe. The United States of America wasn't affected by Liz Truss's mini-budget, so interest rates were ticking up, and it's quite convenient for her political opponents to blame that on the single event of the mini-budget.
Are you saying that she is the unluckiest Prime Minister and that she did absolutely nothing wrong? Because
no,
ultimately,
I didn't say she did absolutely nothing
I'm afraid
wrong.
that you guys put her there. Are you happy with the result?
No, of course not. I mean, this is why I think it's really worthy of serious political study, that a 49-day reign for a Prime Minister is unprecedented. And it's easy, obviously, for her political opponents to say, there's a very simple story about what went wrong. Liz Truss screwed up. All of the blame is on her shoulders. She wasn't up to it. That's a very convenient binary story for her political opponents, both within the Conservative Party and outside. I think it's rather more complicated than that about what went wrong, which is not to say that Liz didn't make any missteps at all. I think she concedes some of them in the book, but it's a lot more complex, the picture there. And I think for those of people on either the right or the left who want to see some radical reform in Britain, the present institutional infrastructure that we have governs us is really problematic.
All right, well, let me just show everyone, because we've got Heather here. This was a campaign poster put out. I'm backing Liz Truss for leader. Do you regret that now?
We came down to 2 people in the end, didn't we? Because I'd supported Penny Mordaunt, who didn't, unfortunately, get through to the final by 8 votes. But, you know, life's like that. You just get on with it. The thing that I'm interested in now is why didn't the Bank of England put up interest rates at the same rate that America did at the time, which is why the pound went down? Why now, when inflation is coming right down from 11.1 to, 3.4, something like that?
So you agree?
Why are the interest rates not coming down now?
Well,
why is the Bank of England still in charge of that now? Why is he not bringing it down now?
So you agree
and
with
why
Mark?
are they also selling £49 billion worth of bonds cheap? They should be allowed to run out. Why are they doing that? Why are people not asking the question of the Bank of England?
All right, well, more broadly, do you agree with Mark Littlewood, then, and what he's outlined, echoing a lot of what Liz Truss has said in her interviews?
I've not read the book, and I don't know that I even want to read the book, in truth. I think we've got a Prime Minister now who the markets do trust.
Right, well...
And that's where we are.
Right, I mean, the markets didn't trust Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, did they, Mark Littlewood? And where is the popular support for the sorts of things you're outlining?
Well, you'd be right to... I'm taking as an inference from your question, Jo, that the Conservative Party is hardly popular at the moment. So I've certainly taken a gamble setting up an organisation called Popular Conservatism. But actually, across the Western world, this sort of popular conservatism is taking off. You're seeing more and more parties on the centre-right who are pointing out structural failures in the way that their countries are organised and are gaining substantial popular support because of that. So I'm pretty confident, if not now, if not this week, even if not before the general election, that the sort of agenda we're putting forward, a full-scale change of the machinery of government, will be popular and its day will come.
Right. Will it, or will it ever come?
Well, I'm of the Conservative wing that likes evolution, not revolution. So I think Mark's position is a little bit more radical than mine might be. But I will say this. I don't want to conflate scrutiny of institutions with what happened to Liz Truss. I'm not really interested in the Premiership. But I think Mark makes a very valid point, which is when you do have more power that goes down to independent bodies, to quangos, actually the accountability needs to be stronger and the scrutiny needs to be stronger of those institutions. Because if you want independence, that independence has to come with responsibility.
Why did she fail, though?
Because I think she made some very bad decisions in terms of what she wanted to sell as a signal with the tax cuts, and inevitably the markets were going to puke on this, and that's what changed dramatically the interest rates. Mark is right to say that interest rates were changing, but it was the pace that I think was the issue.
I mean, Heather just said, well, you know, we just get on with it when Penny didn't win and you backed Liz Truss. But actually, people are still feeling the effects right now. There are people that are being made homeless because of that disastrous budget. There are a lot of people in this country that cannot just get on with life because of Liz Truss. And not only is she not taking responsibility, she's asking people to buy a book about how wonderful she is, which will be in the bookstore bins in the bargain basements before summer. And I just think it's...
reading it then?
No, I've got plenty of toilet roll, I'm good.
A frivolous remark. Mark, just briefly before we move on, we've got this headline, the Daily Telegraph, Sunak faces 50 MPs rebellion over smoking ban. A personal legacy, perhaps, for Rishi Sunak. Is it Conservative?
I don't think it is. I mean, I was a bit shocked when Rishi at the last party conference, his big ideas were changing A-levels and phasing out the ban on smoking. Only New Zealand have tried to bring that through, and the new Conservative government in New Zealand has now actually binned that policy. So I think there are bigger things to look at, actually, across the United Kingdom, rather than these slightly fiddly policies, which I think will actually achieve more harm than good. The black market in tobacco will go through the roof as a consequence if this policy takes root.
Mark Littlewood, thank you very much. But Heather, on the smoking ban, will you be backing the government?
Yeah, I'm voting for it because the change in people's lives with vaping rather than cigarettes has been phenomenally good for our health, for the future of our health service. I mean, at the minute, if you were a smoker, the chances of you actually living to 83 are way, way, way lower than if you are not a smoker at all. I mean, I've been incredibly lucky. My family carry on to 98, 99. So hard luck. I'm going to be around for a very long time. and you know, we're a family of non-smokers. So that's it.
OK, well, we, of course, here on Politics Live will be bringing you the result of that vote on the smoking ban on tomorrow's programme, which is on 11:15, to take in Prime Minister's questions. Let's finish the programme talking about the hate crime law brought in Scotland. The Daily Telegraph, Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, faces Tory vote to repeal the hate crime law. We'll come on to that in just a moment. But first of all, what's the thinking behind this? Why is it necessary, Alison?
Well, what happened in the first instance is that there was a review carried out by Lord Brackadale into existing legislation that we had, some of that going back quite a number of years, taking into account perhaps new things around protected characteristics, and do we need to have a law that takes into account a wider definition of hate crime. So that review was carried out. The legislation came as a result of that review. It was consulted on.
But why do we need it?
Why do we need it? To protect people against hate crime.
Right. They weren't being protected before.
Not equally and not effectively enough. So there's hate crime laws that are very similar in England and Wales as well. It's not a different thing that we have done here. It's very similar to what happens in other countries. So we've consolidated the hate crime law that was there. That then is a wider and more equal protection for everybody under that law. And there are particular offences, for example, the stirring up hatred provisions go back to 1986. Should there be an offence for stirring up hatred that covers other protected characteristics? And that was what the law brings into force.
But there are fears, as you have seen demonstrated. Let's show this tweet from the author J.K. Rowling, who says, if you genuinely imagine I'd delete posts calling a man so as not to be prosecuted under this ludicrous law, stand by for the mother of all April Fool's jokes. This was sent on March the 17th. Is she right that this bill will undermine her right to express her views on a contentious issue?
No. She's not right.
Right, why not?
Because that's not what the law does or what the law says. There's a very high bar to prosecution under this law.
Is it a high bar?
Because, I mean, it doesn't stop you being obnoxious on the internet. People should not be obnoxious on the internet. People should think about the impact.
Would you like to have some of my trolls who seem to be rather Scottish and have never been to Derbyshire in their lives?
I've certainly got lots of trolls coming at me all the time as well, and I expect I will have more of them coming on after this. It doesn't stop people being obnoxious on the internet. There are protections around freedom of speech, but the issue of stirring up hatred is a serious one.
Right.
And the things within the bill as well, which the Tories seem to be overlooking when they're talking about repealing, is about aggravating offences. If they have repealed this law, there is no aggravated offence on attacking people on their religion, attacking people on their race, attacking people on age.
Although women aren't, I noticed, among the protected categories.
There's going to be because women are not a minority, it was considered that there needs to be separate review of this. Baroness Helena Kennedy is looking at what needs to be done to protect women in legislation as well.
Well, let's bring the others in.
Misogyny as a hate crime is something that we're looking at.
So you're going to have a separate. So you're going to have something separate on this. Though the Scottish Conservatives are calling for it to be repealed. Do you back that?
I do. I mean, the tsunami of complaints that went in as soon as this came in, it just shows that, in my opinion, what's actually happened here is you've got a tiny minority of people who shout very, very loudly. And what you've done is ignore what the rest of the everyday Scot person is getting on with their lives. I mean, I know it's a bit of a theme of mine, but if everybody treats everybody with respect, you don't need laws like this.
Why is there a law in England then that does the same?
And we don't have our policemen absolutely inundated with ridiculous claims.
Are you going to join and support Conservatives, not you personally, but Labour supporters in Scotland, to repeal this?
No, I think it's trying to improve what we've got. And we have, throughout, with Scottish colleagues, tried to improve it. We've made amendments around the protections of freedom of speech. But I think now the problem is that now it's a bill. Actually, it's how is that workable? And the Police Federation in Scotland have highlighted they've got real issues around training and understanding this law. And I think it's about ensuring that everybody...
It's an absolute distraction. It really is.
Salma, this issue, though, about the line between having the right to offend, freedom of speech and protecting people from others stirring up hatred against them.
Yeah, I understand the principle and the logic behind it. I think the question that you always have to ask yourself when you put legislation forward of this nature is how enforceable is it and what are the unintended consequences? And if you do have a lot of vexatious claims, I mean, you say that the threshold is very high in order to meet it. But if the threshold is high, then does it actually deal with the issue that you're trying to tackle in the first place? So you end up sort of in circles if you're not actually thinking again through the process of this. And also, you know, you talk about sort of police enforcement of this. I'd love to see the numbers after, in a year's time, to see how many people are actually convicted, how many people are arrested, how much time it actually takes up, and whether it's been an effective piece of legislation or not.
All legislation needs to be looked at on that bar, and it will be reviewed and it will be assessed.
Yeah, but it's whether you ask yourself the question before you pass the legislation.
You don't know how it's going to work until you've passed it.
But
by its very nature, you're not going to know how legislation works until you've passed it.
You can model and you can try and understand this. And the issue with the legislation, with all legislation, is always that people have to predetermine what outcome they want without actually thinking about the process.
You could look at how it operates in England, where it's already in force.
Yeah, well, I mean, take a look at that. It's not brilliant, and the vexatious claims and the police time that it takes it has been quite difficult.
I mean, have the police really got the time and resources to deal with what will probably be, certainly initially, a flood of complaints?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the number of reports put in on day one and the number of reports that have been put in on every day since, it's fallen off a cliff. It was vexatious.
What were the numbers then?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head on that.
7,000 the next day that it came on.
But they will sift through those. They will see what is a proper offence that has to be followed up, has to be reported, as the police do in all cases. They will look at these things properly and effectively and see how the legislation bids in. And all legislation needs time to bid in, to see if it's effective, to see how it's working. Police, on any new piece of legislation, will need time, will need to see how those things bid in, to see how that operates in practice.
How easy is it to make the judgment calls for the police when they have to look at, let's say, for example, that tweet I read out by, or from, I should say, J.K. Rowling. I mean, if you read that tweet, do you think she should be prosecuted under the law?
That's not for me as a politician to decide. That's for the police to investigate and to sit against legislation.
Right, and they've had all the requisite training that they will need to make. What are not easy judgments in cases around people's rights?
Yeah, and the training is there, and the training is ongoing, because that is important. That it's not just one piece of training; it's an ongoing.
Well, the biggest irony that the leader of the SNP in the chamber up in Scotland has got complaints against him as part of this new act. I don't suppose he saw that coming, did he? Unbelievable.
All kinds of things happening on the internet, but I think it's important that we have this legislation, that we have these protections in place, and that there is an impact in hate crimes.
And that's all we have time for. From all of us here, bye-bye.